Well, I must say how truly honoured I am that my colleagues in New York should have organised this occasion, which, as it happens, coincides with my 80th birthday. What a wonderful birthday present you've given me, because it has given me the stimulus to review my life up to this point and to examine what, if anything, I may have contributed to psychology. I hope you'll all forgive me for not appearing among you in person. But to be honest with you, I have reached an age where I find it hard to bear the humiliating rituals of contemporary travel, and so I'd much rather render myself symbolically present among you as a kind of transitional object through the electronic miracle of a DVD. I'm receiving you in the garden of my home, in the lovely Greek island of Corfu. I came here to live 11 years ago when I retired from my practice in England, and like Voltaire's Candide, I've been cultivating my garden ever since. I fell in love with Greece back in the 1960s, when I came to this remarkable orphanage, the Mitera Baby Centre near Athens. I came here to do research on attachment behaviour in Greek infants for my doctorate thesis at Oxford University, and it was quite unlike any other orphanage in the world. It was called Mitera, which is Greek for mother, because its declared policy was to provide the children with substitute mothers for as long as the Mitera was their home. These were unwanted or abandoned babies. And altogether, there were 100 of them, and they were provided with no less than 100 nurses to look after them. The purpose of my research was to investigate the nature of the attachment bonds which formed between the babies and their nurses. Why did I come here? Well, thereby hangs a tale. In the 1960s, behaviorism still ruled in all the universities. And behaviorism held that human beings should be studied as blank slates, and that infant attachment behavior, like all forms of human behavior, was essentially learned through a process of operant conditioning, like that practiced by Pavlov on his unfortunate dogs. Behaviorists believed that children became attached to their mothers because their mothers repeatedly rewarded them with food. This was known as the cupboard love theory, and it was generally held by the psychoanalysts such as Anna Freud and the object relations theorists, as well as the academic psychologists. But a new theoretical approach was gaining ground, and this was of great importance for the research that I did. The brilliant psychiatrist and independent psychoanalyst Dr. John Bowlby completely upset the behaviorists' apple cart by drawing inspiration from the new science of ethology, which studied the behavior of living organisms in their natural habitats and demonstrated how specific patterns of behavior had evolved in different species through the eons of biological time. In 1958, Bowlby published a paper which was to have a profound impact on the psychoanalytic world. In it, he argued that infants became attached to their mothers not so much by learning, as the behaviorists insisted, as by instinct. To say that the academic establishment responded with interest to Bowlby's suggestion would not be very accurate. Fury would be much closer to the mark. He was trying to tread on too many cherished assumptions, and he wanted to bring about a radical paradigm shift before the academic world was ready to accept it. I was more sympathetic to Bowlby's suggestion because I had studied ethology as part of my degree courses at Reading and at Oxford. And at both universities, my professor had convinced me that psychology should be studied as part of biological science. But after all, bios means life. Biology is a study of life in all its manifestations. When I arrived at the Mitera, I found myself in a situation that a young researcher could only dream of. It was a perfect opportunity to test between the cupboard love theory and Bowlby's instinctive theory. You see, these children were receiving multiple mothering on an unprecedented scale. Never in the whole history of mothering had so few received so much from so many. And if the behaviorists were right, then the children would they wouldn't form specific attachments, they would just become generally attached to all the nurses who regularly fed them. But if Bowlby was right, then the instinctive program with which all children are born would impel them to make a specific attachment to one preferred nurse above all the rest. My research proved that Bowlby was right. And what was most interesting was that the pairing of a particular nurse with a particular child had less to do with feeding than with play, with physical contact, with social interaction. The whole process was far more akin to falling in love through mutual delight and attraction rather than operant conditioning. So much for the cupboard love theory. As Jung himself insisted, we should never forget that, biologically speaking, we humans are both mammals and primates. The behaviorists had no objection to seeing attachment bonds in other members of these species as instinctive. But, Bowlby asked, why should we humans be any different? Clearly, individual mothers and children work out their own sets of variations on the attachment process. But the basic patterns of behavior involved are similar throughout our and other species. However, it began to worry me that Bowlby's theoretical focus on the behavior of attachment failed to take account of the intense feelings of love which accompanied it. So I wondered, would Jung's theoretical approach of the archetype provide us with a more comprehensive understanding? I decided to consult the woman who had been my analyst during my student years and to ask her whether Jungian psychology was compatible with my ethological findings. I was particularly fortunate in my analyst, Irene Champernowne. As you can see, she had a sense of humour. Even allowing for an inevitable degree of idealization on my part, she was one of the shrewdest and most impressive women I've ever met. Through her, I had a direct link to the major analytic traditions of her time. She'd had a Freudian analysis in London and had worked with Alfred Adler in Vienna before moving on to Zurich to analyse with Jung and with Tony Wolff. Though Irene came from an intensely religious family, her father was a missionary, she did a degree in natural science, and this brought on a spiritual crisis, which took her into analysis. And she went on to become a lecturer in biology. When she eventually reached Zurich, Irene told me that she had a profound sense of spiritual homecoming, because the Jungian approach had succeeded in drawing together the three primary interests of her life: psychology, religion, and biological science. She said it struck her that Jung had succeeded in reconciling the highest achievements of the human spirit with the base materials out of which that spirit had evolved. She said it was as if Jung had succeeded in building a bridge between Darwin and God, and that the theory of archetypes provided the missing link between nature and the psyche. When I presented to Irene Champernowne the data that I'd collected at the Mitera and asked her if it was compatible with Jungian psychology, her response was very positive, and I found that gratifying, of course, but it was also life-changing for me, because she said something that struck me as being remarkable. She said that archetypes are biological entities which evolved by natural selection, and that they are responsible for much of our behavior as they are for the behavior of other mammalian and primate species, and that in human beings the archetypes had achieved their highest expression in the production of culture and human consciousness. This hit me with the force of a revelation. It was a tremendous statement, and it seemed to me that in making it, Irene had struck the bedrock of psychology as a biological science. It's an insight that has influenced my thinking ever since, and it gave rise to what was my first, and I think probably my most important book, Archetype: A Natural History of the Self. And so, this is the book. This is the edition which was published in London in 1982, and this is the edition that was published in New York in 1983. Fired up by Irene's comments, I was to embark on what I now realize was a hugely presumptuous task. What Bowlby had done for attachment behavior, I set out to achieve for the whole of Jungian psychology. Can you imagine it? in one book. I was determined to bring together everything I knew at that point. I was 49 when this book was published. And I'd spent 15 years researching the literature of ethology, biology, neurology, psychiatry, and, of course, Jungian psychology. What I was doing, I now realize, in retrospect, was that I was attempting to fulfill a dream of Jung's, a very important dream. Do you remember it? His dream of the house? In his dream, Jung finds himself in a strange house, which he nevertheless knows to be his own. He feels impelled to explore every part of it. From the upper story, he eventually reaches the cellar. He lifts a stone slab and sees a narrow staircase leading down into the depths. He goes down to enter a cave cut into the rock. There, he finds scattered bones and broken crockery, like the remains of a primitive culture, and 2 human skulls, very old and half disintegrated. Jung told his dream to Freud on the liner that was taking them from Europe to the United States in 1909. And what interested Freud was the 2 skulls. And he interpreted these as a death wish on the part of Jung against 2 people in his life. And you can be rest assured that Freud thought that one of the people was himself. Anyway, Jung didn't go along with this interpretation at all, but he kept his reservations to himself because Freud could never bear to be contradicted. So he kept all the reservations to himself, but he knew what the dream was about. Jung realized that the house was an image of his psyche. The remains of the primitive culture, the deepest foundations of the house, represented the primitive human being within himself. Well, this dream had as profound an effect on Jung as Irene's comments had had on me. It led him from the highest stories of consciousness down, down, down into the deepest layers of the collective unconscious, where he found the remains of archaic man. That was the whole point of the dream. As he wrote many years later of his practice, together, the patient and I address ourselves to the 2-million-year-old man that is in all of us. In the last analysis, most of our difficulties come from losing contact with our instincts and with the age-old wisdom stored up in us. And where do we make contact with this old man in us? In our dreams. So that seems clear enough. But immediately we find ourselves up against a puzzle, particularly in someone who attached as much importance to his dreams as Jung. The dream leads him down to the biological foundations of the psyche, but he goes no further. Instead, he spends the rest of his life investigating the upper stories, the spiritual manifestations of the psyche. And most of his followers followed his example, as if they were threatened by what lay behind and below the cellar floor. But you know, it was as if they had locked the door slammed it, locked it, and thrown away the key. But of course, you know, in fairy tales, the key is never lost. And the door that is locked is the one that has to be opened. I felt really rather like the prince in the fairy tale, who, having found the key, has to summon up the courage to unlock the door and reveal what lies behind it. I chose this cover with great care. You see that it gives prominence to the staircase, a spiral staircase, like two in the Chateau of Blois in the Loire Valley of France. One leading up and the other leading down. I took this illustration from a 17th century woodcut in a French carpenter's manual. On the left, you see the carpenter's plan of the staircase, what we might call the archetype of the staircase. And on the right, the finished staircase with people walking up and down it, what we might call the archetype actualized in reality. The adjacent spirals represent the ultimate biological symbol, the two spirals of DNA. They also symbolize the ascent and descent inherent in the human life cycle and in the spiritual journey of the individuation quest. So the cover sums up, as I believe a good cover should, what the book is all about. Jung totally accepted that personal experience was of crucial significance in the development of each individual. But he denied that this development takes place in a personality which is unstructured, unprepared, like a blank slate. On the contrary, for Jung, the role of personal experience was to develop what is already there, what already exists as archetypal potential in the collective unconscious, that is to say, in the neuropsychic structures that we all share by virtue of our humanity. Archetypal potentials, such as the mother and the child, have the dynamic property of seeking their actualization in the behavior and the personality of the individual as the life cycle unfolds in the context of the environment. The mother archetype is activated in the child's personal psyche through the presence of a female caretaker whose characteristics and behavior are similar enough to the innate anticipations built into the maternal archetype of the child to perceive her as mother. In this way, the mother archetype is activated in the collective unconscious as the attachment relationship develops, and is built into the personal psyche of the child in the form of the mother complex. The same is true of the father archetype. Jung stressed again and again that one knows when an archetype has been constellated because the person or the object responsible for its activation is experienced as numinous. That is to say, as wonderful, special, awe-inspiring, miraculous. Well, there can be no doubt, can there, that mothers and babies experience one another as numinous, as do lovers when the archetype of the anima or animus is activated by a member of the opposite sex. Numinous experience is the hallmark of archetypal possession. The subject feels possessed. In birds, some similar process is at work. Young ducks and geese, for example, identify as mother the first moving object they encounter on emerging from the egg. Appropriately enough, because it usually is their mother. These goslings that you see here are orphans. They were hatched in an incubator. And the first moving object they saw on hatching was Dr. Konrad Lorenz, and they imprinted him as mother. Hence the typical following behavior you see in this picture. Jung was careful to point out that the archetype is not an inherited idea, but an inherited mode of functioning, corresponding to the inborn way in which a chick emerges from the egg, the bird builds its nest, or the eels find their way across the Atlantic from the Bermudas. As he says in his foreword to Esther Harding's book, Woman's Mysteries. In other words, it is a pattern of behavior. This aspect of the archetype, the purely biological one, is the proper concern of scientific psychology. Those are Jung's actual words, and I shan't forget my excitement when I first read them. But of course, the archetype is more than just a pattern of behavior, because it is charged with feeling. In the same passage, Jung goes on, but the picture changes at once when looked at from the inside, from within the realm of the subjective psyche. Here, the archetype appears as a numinous factor, as an experience of fundamental significance. This convinced me that Jung's theoretical approach to the attachment bond went an important step further than Bowlby's. I came to see that by neglecting the archetypal background to the attachment bond, Bowlby had excluded a factor of enormous prognostic significance. Because what matters for healthy psychic development is not always the actual behavior of the personal mother out there. What matters is the archetypal experiences activated by her in the maturing psyche of the child. This is of clinical importance in treating patients who come into analysis with dysfunctional parental complexes, because what those archetypal potentials which the personal parents have failed to actualize in the child, those potentials still exist in the unconscious, seeking realization in outer reality. Now, this insight represents a major advance on neo-Freudian and object relations conceptions and theories about the creative significance of the transference and how it can be employed greatly to help people who come into analysis with what I have called parent hunger. Having dealt extensively with the mother and father archetypes, I went on to examine other aspects of Jungian theory from the evolutionary archetypal perspective: personal identity and the stages of life, the anima and animus, the shadow, the persona, and, most important of all, the self. The self is the most profound of Jung's concepts, and he conceived it not as something created afresh by each individual in the course of personal development as the object relations people believe, but as an innate propensity, as something given, like a hand of cards dealt to us at the moment of birth, with which we play the great game of life. The self provides a blueprint. It provides the archetypal scenario that shapes each chapter of our personal biography. And in my book, I attempted to describe the scenario and to sketch out the blueprint. The crucial insight that came out of my conversation with Irene all those years ago has guided everything I've written since. Here you see my book spread out on this Elizabethan table. The past is just as important as the present and the future, and I've always felt particularly close to the Elizabethan age. For much of my life, I lived in an Elizabethan house. This was in the glorious county of Devon in the southwest of England. Devon has always been a seafaring county. It was the home of the famous Elizabethan sea dogs, Sir Francis Drake, Sir John Hawkins, Sir Walter Raleigh. My home, Fardell Manor, had been in the Raleigh family for 300 years, and this fact features in this portrait of myself, painted at Fardell over 12 years ago. The artist, Francis Hamill, discovers me in my study, surrounded by my books. I turn to see who's entering the room. The sleeve, incidentally, is a quotation from a portrait by Titian. The globe resting on the table beside me, it's the same Elizabethan table, incidentally. I brought it with me from England to Greece. The globe represents the self, or rather some assorted aspects of the self which it struck the artist that I had actualized in my life. The ape represents my primate cousins. The house is my Elizabethan house, and there is the sea, with Sir Walter's ship sailing over it, the great turbulent unconscious over which the ego navigates its way on its own voyage of discovery, its own self-realization. My little dachshund, Griselda, demands my attention. She cherishes my mammalian anima, and I her animus. Just above Griselda is the Ouroboros, the snake eating its tail, the ultimate symbol of self-completion, invoking the eternal process of creation and destruction, of death and rebirth. The pile of books on my left encapsulates my intellectual position. My own book, On Jung, is sandwiched between Darwin's Origin of Species and Jung's Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious. The structure of my book On Jung came to me in a dream. In my dream, I saw a splendid rainbow, which arched up into the air and arced and came back down to earth in a landscape which was numinous. I recognized it as savanna. And as I admired the rainbow, it split into three parts, a lower, a middle, and an upper arc. And as I watched, these three arcs began to vibrate and to interact with one another. And then I woke up, and I knew immediately what it was about. It was telling me that my book must incorporate 3 strands of meaning. The lowest arc of the rainbow represented the archetypal stages of the human life cycle that we all go through, from childhood through adolescence, early maturity, midlife, late maturity, and going on into old age and death. The middle arc represented Jung's biography as he passed through each of these stages. And the final arc represented the theories, the insights, the understandings that came to Jung as he passed through each of these stages. And what of the landscape? Well, I realized that this was the archetypal landscape in which our species evolved hundreds of thousands of years ago, right up in the Rift Valley in Central Africa. What has moved me is the fascinating way in which the micro-history of the individual comes to be grafted onto the macro-history of the species. All my books have examined this process, particularly my book on dreams and on symbols. And in the 2-million-year-old self, I tried to bring together the threads of the whole amazing drama of micro-macro integration. I particularly enjoyed working on the book that I wrote with John Price on evolutionary psychiatry, because not only did we realize we were breaking new ground in psychiatry, but we were unearthing a wealth of evidence supporting Jung's insights into the operation of archetypes. We came to see quite clearly that archetypes are intermediate between the genes and experience. Archetypes are the means by which the innate becomes personal. In volume 3 of my latest book, The Talking Cure, published by Darrell Sharp last year, I argue that the new breed of evolutionary psychotherapists should not be seen as rivals to Jungian analysts, but rather as companions of the way. We can learn from them, and their work could benefit tremendously if practiced in the broad human spirit of Jung, and also with an understanding of the curing potential of the self. Because after all, Jung was the first human ethologist. He was the first evolutionary psychiatrist. All this remains of tremendous importance, because in recent years, all forms of depth psychology have come under attack. And in many quarters, Jung's idea of archetypes functioning in the collective unconscious have been dismissed as mystical baloney. Increasingly, insurance companies, fee-paying clients are requiring evidence to support the value of what we do in our consulting rooms, because we have entered a post-apostolic era in which it's no longer possible for us to appeal to the authority of Dr. Jung to justify what we're doing. At the present stage of our history, the thing that confronts Jungian psychology most crucially is epistemology. Why do we do what we do? Why do we believe what we believe? And what evidence have we got to support it? That is the crucial issue for us all. Life on this island is so agreeable that I never feel tempted to go off it. And I haven't been to England for years. Fortunately, I don't need to, because the people that I love come regularly to see me here. And a special one of these is Sally Vickers. Before she became a celebrated novelist, Sally was a Jungian psychotherapist, and she did part of her training with me back in the 1980s. And since then, over the years, a firm friendship has developed between us. Sally, remind me, what was it that made you choose me to do your training analysis with?
It was your first book, Archetypes. I was always attracted to Jung, and the spiritual side of Jung, but I've always felt that we're essentially animals as human beings, and I loved the way you brought together the instinctive life and the animal life with the imaginative life and the spiritual thoughts of Jung. So it was your first, and in your eyes, I know, best book.
And as a result of our analytical work together, what effect would you say that had on your practice as a psychotherapist?
Well, a great deal, but I suppose your understanding of the maternal instinct, when women came to me who had been alienated from their maternal instinct through some kind of parental inadequacy, I found it very helpful to work with the understanding that it was a genetic disposition that they were being alienated from. But also we live in a culture which has made enormous strides for women, and I'm a great supporter of feminism, of course I am, but it's brought its cost. And I think one of the costs of our culture is that it reinforces this kind of alienation from a natural maternal instinct in women. And I found that women were often feeling quite guilty about their instinctive responses to their children and family life.
Carrying that further, how would you say that our work together had impacted on your life?
Oh, well, in many profound and rich ways, but I suppose I was lucky that my own relationship with my children was always very good, and so that aspect of my own personal life was much enhanced by working with you. But I think where I really felt the benefit in my later years was as a novelist, because my relationship to my own creative impulses was greatly fostered by my work with you on the whole maternal instinct. And my own relationship with my books is a kind of development of my relationship with my children. I feel about them as I feel about my children, and I feel protective of them. I hate it when I have to give them up and they have to go into the public domain. And so I think what I felt is there's a sort of development of that whole recognition of the crucial import of the maternal instinct in the feminine psyche.
I know that not all Jungians agree with my approach, and some have even accused me of promoting a kind of biological fundamentalism. Well, this is a calumny which I have refuted in the afterword of my book, Archetype Revisited. This is the edition which was published in London in 2002, and this is the edition published by Darrell Sharp in Toronto in 2003. It's also been suggested that all my life I've been wasting my time, because Jungians can function perfectly well without biology, and biologists can do perfectly well without Jung. Well, I mean, this could well be true, but is that a reason why I should stop? You see, I know that the area which promotes the most energy and excitement is where disciplines meet. And I've certainly found this in comparing Jung with the ethologists and with the evolutionary psychiatrists. And from the letters I've received, I know then I'm not alone. And in any case, it's the path along which my individuation has carried me, and I've enjoyed the trip. As I approached 70, I knew that I'd reached the point in the life cycle where I had to grow old and die. And so I came here to do it. Giving up my practice and my home in England was a necessary initiation into this final stage, the end of my visit, my lifetime's visit to this miraculous planet. As an introvert, I've always loved islands, especially Greek islands, and particularly this, the most beautiful, the most fertile, the most civilized of all Greek islands, the island of Corfu. When I look at a timeless scene like this, there's something deeply familiar about it, as if the 2-million-year-old self is seeing it through my eyes. It's the kind of view that our species has gazed on generation after generation, millennium after millennium, since it began its migration out of Africa, spreading along the continental coasts to Europe, Asia, Australia and America. Richard Dawkins conceives us as vehicles used by our genes to achieve their purposes. I see us more as vessels for the self, the ancient, evolved self that fulfills itself in our lives for the brief sojourn that we are here.